Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Waffle podcast with me, Bellshaw-Naylor, and Marva Gregorio de Souza. And together we will try to talk about research without any gobbledygook. Each episode we'll be talking to a researcher who will discuss the work they're doing, look at why this research is important, and asking how the hell did they get into this field. We hope that it will be informative and interesting and bring a bit of the academic world into the real world. This week we have Professor Peter Rich, who's based at University College London. Hi Peter, and welcome.
Yeah, my official title is Professor of Bioenergetics, which means I'm interested in energy, how we get energy in our bodies. And I work in UCL in the Structural and Molecular Biology department. And I've been here nearly 20 years, I think.
Wow. And how did you get into it? How did you get into the energy?
I think that was just a natural progression. When I did my undergraduate degree, I ended up doing a project on what's called electron transfer processes, which is stuff to do with energy.
Yeah.
And ever since then, it's been a natural progression to get more embedded in that sort of area of biochemistry.
Right, cool.
Oh. Okay, do you want to give us a little bit of an elevator pitch about the actual research you're doing at the moment?
Okay, well, probably like most labs, my lab does two different things. One is basic science, which is much harder to explain the benefits of to the public, and the other is more applied research. So for the basic research, I've been involved in particular in looking at the enzyme in our bodies, which is responsible for using the oxygen that we breathe. And that relates to energy, because we need to breathe and use oxygen to get all of the bits of the machinery going to give us the energy that we need to survive. And so the enzyme I work on is the one that actually uses the oxygen that we breathe.
Okay.
And as you can imagine, it's a rather important enzyme to work properly. If you stop breathing, you don't last very long. And so we're trying to understand how this enzyme is working and how it malfunctions as well in various types of disease states. Right. Because again, as you might imagine, if the enzyme isn't working properly, you can get problems, particularly with energy requiring bits of our body, such as our brain and our muscle.
Yeah. And
there are quite a few diseases which have been recognised related to that enzyme, and other enzymes which are downstream from that one for giving us energy.
Okay.
So
now for the simple-minded, such as myself, with enzymes, how is it relating to the cells? Is it a cell, or is it
an enzyme is a protein,
right,
which is a very big molecule inside the cell. In this case, in a particular subsection of the cell called mitochondria, which you might have heard about in the media, possibly. And they're called the powerhouse of the cell for exactly the reason they're the ones that are producing the energy from the food we eat in a form that the rest of the cell can use.
Right.
So our bodies are full of this enzyme, the vast amount of this enzyme in us, as you can imagine. Because you're breathing, you're using 370 litres of oxygen every day just sitting there.
Wow.
And if you start moving a lot, you use a lot more.
Okay.
And your body is equivalent to something like 100-watt light bulb of power requirement.
Oh, wow.
And that's all driven by the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe,
right,
providing the energy that we want. So this is the enzyme which is the last one in the series of grabbing the energy from the food, and it's the one which converts the oxygen into water. So we breathe in oxygen and it comes out as water.
Wow.
And so the second thing we do in my lab, and probably many labs now, have an applied aspect. We use very advanced types of technology to look at this type of enzyme. But we also try to exploit the technology for making simple new devices to go into hospitals for medical diagnostic purposes.
Right.
And so for about the last 10 years, we've had various projects going with the different hospitals in London and different physicians and even surgeons, where we're trying to adapt our very advanced equipment to make a simple form that eventually can be used by a nurse in the hospital to diagnose things which are hard to diagnose accurately at the moment.
Right.
Pointless making a diagnosis for something which is easy. and simple.
Yeah.
So we're going for ones which are difficult or expensive to do accurately.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
And have you got some examples of something I can understand? You're working on?
One aspect that we have been involved in, and there's activity around the world on this, is to look at typing cancer biopsy samples. By typing, I mean to decide what stage of the cancer they're at and whether they are cancerous or not.
Right.
So the way this works normally in a hospital is you take a biopsy sample, for example from the esophagus, a small piece of tissue,
Yeah.
and that goes to the histologists, and usually two of them look at it, and they make a decision based on visual inspection of whether it's cancerous and what stage it's at.
Wow.
But this, obviously, there's human judgment in that, so it's not always a perfect diagnosis, and sometimes the histologists disagree with each other. So we've had a project, for example, using our technology to try to get the machine to do the diagnosis. And that's been taken off quite well. In fact, my last two PhD students have now formed a company in order to take that further and try to commercialise it.
Oh, good.
And then the other thing we've been doing is looking at kidney diseases which are difficult to detect by conventional means.
Right.
And we've managed to make a method where we take a small amount of patient urine and we look for marker chemicals in the urine which tell us whether the person has that disease or not.
That's
so,
really good.
So these diseases are related to kidney malfunction diseases, and that there we collaborate with people in the Hammersmith Hospital and the Royal Free Hospital.
Okay.
We've even had one of our machines operated by nurses in the Royal Free Hospital for about 6 months.
Because that is one of the problems with I think with the NHS, where it's about finding the time that it takes them to get the diagnosis of what is actually wrong. And so then you've got all the symptoms, and then they go and they get referred, and of course that takes ages.
And
so
there's the human problem as well. So for
Yeah.
example, if somebody goes in for a biopsy analysis of cancer, they often have to wait 2 or 3 weeks for the histologist report to come back. Just imagine if you could have a bedside diagnosis where they immediately gave you the diagnosis. In the future, that will be possible, I'm sure.
Could you see that happening in the GP, in primary care? In actually bringing
Possibly
it
in the future, as the technology and the machinery gets better. It might even be possible to not take a biopsy sample at all eventually, and just put a light pipe, for example, onto your esophagus.
Right.
Wow.
And instead of taking a biopsy sample, all that is possible in the future.
Yeah.
But you should be aware that there's a huge gap between what you can do in a research laboratory with trained people who are experts in the area, and translating that into having a nurse or a GP being able to do these things routinely. So that is an enormous gap.
So I take it you're working, is that like a long-term plan, and there's stages to build up to that?
That's right.
So you're still at the lab stage at the moment?
It's at the lab stage, except that we have had a machine that we installed in the Royal Free Hospital for 6 months, getting nurses to take what we call spectra, which is like something we can analyse of the urine samples of patients coming through.
Yeah.
And there we were looking for different types of markers related to what they thought was wrong with the patient. And so we're still working on that data.
Okay.
But in general, at the moment, yes, these things are still lab-based.
Yeah.
Right.
And how long do you think it would be to sort of get to is it a matter of years, do you think?
I think it would take years, because even though you can demonstrate something works in a lab, in order to get it into practice in a clinic, you have to have huge trials which cost a lot of money and a lot of time, and it all has to be very rigorously proven that any new technique is as good or better than present one. And of course it's got to be more economical as well.
And the NHS is so resource-wise, they're stretched.
That's
so for the time that it takes for someone to learn something new, a new procedure, then that's one of the reasons why people are so reluctant to take on new ones.
And
they haven't got time to learn.
And quite
something
rightly,
new.
they have to be extremely careful about taking on a new type of technology and replacing a current one. Because if there was something wrong and it went wrong, as you can imagine, that would be disastrous for the patients and for the NHS generally.
Yes. So how do you balance? It's quite two different, well, not two different areas, but they're doing two different things, aren't you? And trying to.
They're two different things, but they have the common factor of the technology that we use.
Right.
So we use some very advanced types of technology in order to do the basic research, and we've since exploited that same technology.
Right.
To measure other things, in this case medically, diagnostically relevant things.
So is this the order that it happened? So you thought, okay, well let's look at, I like this enzyme, the one that does takes the oxygen. We like this enzyme. Let's study it and have a look at it. How can we study it? What do we need? If we have something that, because you use spectroscopies.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then let's use that to vibrate it and see what happens and see how the enzyme reacts and study the enzyme. So you design the technology to be able to study the enzyme, and then as you've got this design technology, you thought, what else can we use it for? Let's use it.
Well, UCL has been a good place for that because we're very centrally placed in an academic environment surrounded by hospitals, including UCH.
Yeah.
So the way that I got into this about 10 years ago is having developed this technology generally for the basic research. Mm-hmm. I then gave various talks in UCL attended by physicians and medical people, saying what the technology is and saying, look, is anybody interested in us looking at trying to adapt this to any specific disease diagnosis problem that you might have. Okay. And so that's how I then got involved with physicians, because to do that type of work you need a complicated network of people. You need basic scientists who understand the physics and the chemistry and the biology, and you need physicians who are able to get samples from patients. You have to sign up patients. You can't just go and take bits of patients or even a urine sample from a patient without their permission as to the fact that you're going to do some kind of analysis on it. Right. So there's a huge sort of network of people involved in such studies. But as I say, UCL is a great environment for doing that because we're so close to the hospital. So for example, with the cancer work, what would happen would be my PhD students would go into the operating theatre when they were taking some biopsy samples of esophageal cancer in this case, come back with the samples, measure them immediately in our machine, and then take them back to the hospital because we don't damage them at all, so they could be histologically examined. There would be no other way that we could do that. We couldn't ask patients to give biopsy samples purely for a speculative project.
Right.
But in this way, it was just an additional test, and then we could compare our results with the histologist's results, for example. Okay. But of course, when we disagreed with the histologist, there's a question: were we right or were they right? And that's a.
Yeah, that's it.
But there should be a way to go back and
so in the long term, you can see what's happened with the patients. Yes, over a long
period of time.
So over a very long period, that issue can be solved. Yes.
Right. Wow. So then, because like talking about with the patients and giving permission, do you find you're probably one step removed from it, but do you find that there's an issue with patients giving permission?
I wasn't directly involved with getting the patient permission for the cancer biopsy samples, so I'm not quite sure there. But I know for the diagnosis of urine samples, that's never really been a problem at all.
Right.
The Royal Free has a meeting once a year that brings together patients with certain diseases.
Right.
And I'd go there myself and give a talk, and then they have a mechanism to sign them up then to the study to allow us to use their urine samples for analysis.
Yeah.
Of course, that one's an easy one because it's not really asking the patients to do anything.
Yes, you're giving away the urine anyway.
You're giving away,
You're not going to worry about giving your urine.
That's not quite such a commitment as giving an extra biopsy sample.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the biopsy samples, the fact that we were able to do an analysis without damaging the sample, so it could still be analysed in the conventional way at no extra cost in terms of biopsy provision to the patient, meant that study was feasible. But you could imagine it would be much more difficult if you had to take a sample and it was only your test and it was still experimental. Then that would be much more difficult, quite understandably.
Yeah. So I was going to say that when you walk a dog, just as a sideline, and you have to like clear up their mess. I was house sitting, dog sitting last week, and then the dog looks at you like while you're clearing up the mess. Why do you do that? Where are you going with that?
Yeah.
So I can see why with some certain functions. People won't mind donating. Really? You really want that?
Well, there is also the ethical issue as well. That people might not want to know what's wrong with them. That is the case sometimes.
Really?
So
must be a big decision to find out.
So I mean that is an issue as well. That's why you always have to get patient agreement, even if you're doing some analysis which is really not affecting them at all.
It still belongs to them, doesn't it? I suppose
that's right. And of course there's data protection then as well. You have to make sure if the patients are in the NHS, there's a question about having access to their medical records and all of that sort of thing as well. That's why I say you need a huge network of people in order to make these things possible to do in research.
I'm just thinking it through. It's so huge and it sounds so important, but you've got so many hurdles, haven't you? And so many, the costs must be a lot, and just trying to get, like you say, get all the people involved. But if it works and you can get it down to this one simple test that people, it'd be just vital for people. It's just amazing to be able to find out there and then.
Well, as I say, the way we do is we latch on to things which are going on in the hospitals where they've got a problem. In either it's too expensive or too time consuming, or in some cases not even possible to do to measure, then they're quite happy to try to get us involved as well. And then of course they already have the infrastructure of the patients and the consent issue process and all of that sort of thing, and collecting the samples, because that's another thing, collecting samples. For example, another thing we look at is saliva. To do with certain kidney diseases. Now a saliva sample, of course, patients would be generally happy to give us those, but you need to control that. It's no good having a saliva sample if they've just eaten a lot of stuff or they've just drunk a lot of stuff. So you can't just come along and just give a bit of saliva. It has to be under some sort of control.
So eating sort of like 6 hours before or something for the last 6 hours, which I would find very difficult.
So you need some way to try to quality control when you're taking the saliva sample, that sort of thing. So there's all these issues that require being addressed that you don't think of until you start analysing stuff and realising that.
So have you got a big team that helps you with this?
I've been decreasing my team because I'm getting older now, so I'm trying to do less rather than more. My last two full-time, two of my PhDs recently finished, and they're the ones who set up that company. And now I have one student shared with the Royal Free Hospital who's doing the kidney project stuff. So the cancer stuff is now completely with the students who've gone off to set a company and set up the company. So at the moment I've just got one student and a technician, part of a technician, and I take on the odd undergraduate student. And I may take on a postdoc later in the year again, but I'm keeping the team small now.
You've got a wider network, I suppose.
I've got an extremely wide network of people. That's right.
That's vital to your work. It's incredible.
It's very exciting. So, I have a more personal question. So, take yourself back to when you were a wee lad. If you weren't doing this, what would you have wanted to do? Have you always wanted to be sort of like a scientist or a researcher?
Not particularly. I think I was the first person in my family to go to a university. I didn't even know what a university degree was when I signed up to go to a university. But friends of mine were signed up for biochemistry. That seemed like fun, so I signed up for the same sort of thing. And so we got into it from there. But also I was like building stuff. when I was a school kid, I used to buy cheap motorbikes, because at that time people were selling fantastic motorbikes to buy cars. So I used to buy them and do them up. And take them apart. So I always had this thing of taking machinery apart and rebuilding it, which has been very useful in my career to adapt this technology in order to do the things that we want. So maybe I would have been a motorcycle mechanic.
Excellent. Oh, that's so cool. So when was the last time you rode a motorcycle?
When I left the UK to take up a postdoc position in the States, I had to sell my beloved motorbike in order to pay for the air ticket. So a long time ago.
So that probably brings us back to, so talk us through how you you came to be professor here. So you said you started off doing a biochemistry degree. Was that at UCL?
No, I did an undergraduate degree in Bristol, and then when I finished my degree, I wasn't sure what to do. Actually, I went to Norway and I got a job chopping up whale meat, and they were still getting with chopping up huge slabs of whales into steak-sized portions. And I applied for one PhD position, which was in Cambridge, and they offered it to me. So I gave up my job in Norway and came back and went to Cambridge, where I stayed for a while, did a postdoc in the States, went back to Cambridge. And then I took over a private research institute from somebody called Peter Mitchell in Cornwall. This is a whole story in itself. Very complicated, but very controversial story. Somebody who opted out of the academic world to set up his own place. And he was ostracised from the scientific community for many years. He had to rely on private money, but he had got a Nobel Prize in 1978, and so that he was accepted back into the scientific community. And I went from Cambridge and took over as research director of this institute from in Cornwall. But eventually it got to be too difficult to keep a private research institute going financially, so I moved the operation into UCL nearly 20 years ago.
Wow. How exciting!
There's been books written about Peter Mitchell and the difficulty of introducing radical ideas into science.
I'll tell you what, I'll look it up and I will I'll put a link as well next to it on on the website, and we can have a little look.
There's a book called Wandering in the Gardens of the Mind, which was published by Oxford University Press, if you're interested in the background.
That's really interesting. It's such a... It's hard. It's like, as a society or as human beings, we're very reluctant to change or to new things, and yet it's the change in new things that make us survive.
Well, science is very political in itself, and people get a great vested interest in their view of how things work. And when Peter Mitchell came along, he was to do with energy metabolism, and he suggested an extremely radical idea as to how energy is gotten from our food into a form that can be used in our bodies, which was at the border between physics and chemistry and biology. And so there were quite a few people who didn't have that range of knowledge in order to understand it properly, partly. And so it took many years of acrimonious infighting before it became accepted. And as I said, Mitchell went and set up his own laboratory with his own money that he'd inherited in order to do experiments and to publish. In fact, the two most critical papers on this he published privately with a printer in Bodmin in Cornwall. And they're still not accessible by normal routes, these two, and yet they're the two cornerstone papers in the area.
Wow.
They're called the Grey Books.
Sounds very mysterious.
I've got the last few remaining copies over in my office.
So you're the person to know to come and have
what if there was suddenly a mysterious break in our podcast without
people asking to look at them?
Grey Books go missing.
I don't think you'll be able to sell them for very much on eBay.
And our last bit, I think you've touched on this, and I think it's very clear why your research is important. But if you could round it up, how would you say,
Well,
why is this research that you're doing so vital to people like Martha and me out there?
I think with the basic research, it's always very difficult to sort of give a very clear thing on that. I can say, like anybody working on an enzyme, that if it goes wrong, there will be disease states. And in order to fix the disease state, often you need to know how the thing is going wrong and how it's influencing your body.
Yeah.
So this basic research, without the basic research, you'll never get to that stage. But there's a huge distance between what I do in the basic research and getting to that sort of level. But there are people, not myself, who work on the more medical aspects, and so that work contributes to it.
Right.
For the more applied stuff, it's more obvious that it's a benefit, particularly if you've got one of the diseases that we're able to contribute to.
Yeah.
And hopefully the timescale for getting that type of technology into actual practice is much shorter, maybe years rather than possibly decades for the basic research.
No, I think it's excellent. 'Cause it's like at one point I was studying psychology and I was looking at Freud. Yeah, right. But he did all of his research and come up with this whole philosophy about it, looking at people who were ill. And I think what you're doing is absolutely right. It's like, well, if we can't fix what's broken unless we understand how it works. If we don't understand exactly how something works when it's working properly, but like all his theories about the human mind and about how we have all these how we function, he did it by studying people who were broken.
Yeah.
And so, well, how can you? They're broken, so you can't fix a car. You can't decide how a car works by studying only broken cars.
So you need to go back and look at the fit ones, the ones that are working, and understand, this is how it's working.
I think there's a whole range of different things. For some instances, you need to get down to the real basics in order to think about how you might fix the thing. In other cases, you're a bit more lucky, and you can use just a symptom to attack without knowing where that came from.
Right, yeah.
But so you won't know if it's a symptom because it could be, well, that's how it works. It's just normal.
So, I guess diabetes may be an example where there's a problem with the sugar levels.
Yeah.
And if you control the sugar levels, you can control the diabetes without really having to understand all the basic mechanisms.
Right.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you understand the basic mechanism, maybe you can go to the source point and fix that.
Yeah. Rather than
it could give you the answers to lots of other things as well, I suppose.
Possibly.
It's an old thing.
If you're interested in the cell process and the energy process and all the diseases coming from that, there's a fantastic organisation in the United States called the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, UMDF, which is a charity raising money for research into diseases of mitochondria, which are the bits of the cells that house the enzyme that we work on, and lots of other enzymes to do with energy metabolism, and that would have some good links as well.
Excellent, brilliant.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much to everybody for listening. We'll put links up on our website, which is www.antiwafflepodcast.wordpress.com, and we've also got a Twitter account, which is @antiwafflepod. Please do get in touch because we'd love to hear from you. We will put on the website links to Peter's work and the work that he's mentioned. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.
Bye.